"You bastard!" Gus yelled, for the first time fighting back in this nightmare. She kicked the tire. She looked into the back seat, expecting to see Chris's face as they squealed away. But instead, she saw her husband reach into the rear of the car to set him free. And she wondered why it had taken so long to notice that all this time, James had been sitting in the passenger seat. Hello, my book club friends, and welcome back to another episode of our book club. Let's see, we just finished our discussion of we just finished our discussion of readings 2 and 3, and we're starting on page 36. It says "then" of the summer of 1984. Give me just 1 second. So, anyways, we're starting on page 36. It says "then" in the summer of 1984, so we're going back to the past again. This time, Gus dreamed she was driving down Route 6. In the back of the Volvo, Chris was ramming an action figure against the buttress of his car seat. Beside him, face obscured by the angle of the rearview mirror, was the baby. "Is she drinking her bottle?" Gus asked Chris, the big brother, the co-pilot. But before he could answer, a man knocked on the window. She smiled and rolled it down, ready to give directions. He waved a gun under her nose. "Get out of the car," he said. Shaking, Gus turned off the ignition. She stepped out of the car. They always told you to get out of the car, and she threw the keys as far as she could to the middle of the next lane. "Bitch!" the man yelled, diving for the keys. Gus knew she had less than 30 seconds. Not enough time to unlatch both car seats, to drag both children out, to get them both to safety. He was coming at her again. She had to make a choice. She scrambled for the rear door latch, sobbing, "Come on, come on," she cried, jiggling the latch on the infant seat and pulling the baby into her arms. She raced to the other side of the car, Chris's side, but the man was already revving up the engine, and she watched, hugging one child while the other was spirited away. "Gus, Gus!" She came awake sporadically and tried to focus on her husband's face. "You were whimpering again." "You know," Gus said breathlessly, "they say that if you whimper in your sleep, you are screaming in your dream." "Same nightmare?" Gus nodded. This time it was Chris. James hugged his arm around Gus and rubbed the skin of her enormous belly, feeling the bumps and ridges that would be knees and elbows. "This isn't good for you," he murmured. Let me scoot this forward so we can see Mr. Slothy Cakes. All right. That seems a little loud, doesn't it, for you, he murmured. I know. She was soaked in sweat. Her heart was going a mile a minute. Maybe I should see someone. "A psychiatrist?" James scoffed. "Come on, Gus, it's just a nightmare." He gentled his tone, adding, "Besides, we live in Bainbridge." He pressed his lips against her neck. "No one's going to carjack you. No one's going to steal our kids." Gus stared up at the ceiling. "How do you know?" she asked quietly. "How can you be so sure that your life is the one that's charmed?" Then she padded down the hall to her son's room. Chris slept, sprawled across his bed, his body flung wide as a promise. He slept, Gus thought, with the conviction of someone who knows he is safe. And the next section, moving right along to the next section. Schloss says hello. He said, "Hey, how you doing today?" I don't know what that was. I don't know where that came from, but you're welcome. All right, okay. Serious. I'm being serious now. We're back to the series. God, I keep seeing the freaking ring light in my book. I don't know how people do this. Maybe if I put the blue light glasses on, that'll help. I don't know. Oh my God, I just tripped over a fucking 25-pound weight. No big deal, I'm fine. Everything's fine. It's fine. All right, let's try this again. So we're moving on to the next section. We are on page 37. The summer had been unusually hot, something Gus attributed not to El Nino or to global warming, but to Murphy's Law. Since she happened to be in the middle of her second pregnancy, every morning for the past 2 weeks, as the temperature had climbed to 85 degrees, Gus and Melanie had taken the children to Tally Pond, a town-run swimming hole. Chris and Emily were at the water's edge, their heads bent together, their bare limbs tangled and brown as cider. Gus watched Emily muddy her hands and hold them tenderly to Chris's face. "You're an Indian," Emily said, the streaks of her fingers leaving war paint on his cheeks. Chris bent down to the water and scooped up 2 palmfuls of mud. He slapped his hands onto Emily's bare chest, trailing dirt over her belly. "You too," he said. "Uh-oh," Gus murmured. "Guess I ought to break that habit early." Melanie laughed. "Mauling girls, you mean? With any luck, by the time it matters, his objects of attention will choose to wear their bikini tops." Emily bounced back from Chris, squealed, and took off at a run down the narrow beach. Melanie watched them disappear behind a promontory. "I ought to go get them," she said. "Well, you'll certainly get there faster than I would," Gus agreed. She tilted her head back and dozed off until the sand trembled with pounding of feet, and she blinked up to find Emily and Chris standing in front of her, absolutely naked. "We want to know why Emily has a giant," Chris announced. Behind them, Melanie came into view, holding the discarded bathing suits. "A giant?" Chris pointed to his penis. "Yeah," he said, "I have a penis and she has a giant." Melanie smiled benignly. "I brought them back," she said. "You play wise woman." Gus cleared her throat. I'm sorry. Where was I at? Oh, okay. Gus cleared her throat. "Emily has a vagina," she said, "because Emily's a girl. Girls have vaginas and boys have penises." Emily and Chris looked at each other, speaking volumes. "Can she buy a penis?" Chris asked. "No," Gus said. "You get what you get. It's like Halloween candy." "But we want to be the same," Emily whined. "No, you don't," Gus and Mel said simultaneously. Melanie held out the bottom of Emily's bikini. "Now get dressed," she said. "You too, Chris." The children dutifully scrambled into their wetsuits and wandered down to the sand city they'd built earlier that morning. Melanie looked at Gus. "Halloween candy?" Gus laughed. "Like you could have done better." Melanie sat back down. "At the wedding," she said, "we'll look back at this and laugh." Charlie, James's hunting dog, had been sick for some time. The previous year, Michael had diagnosed an ulcer and prescribed medicines like Tagamet and Zantac, human medicines that cost a fortune. He had to be fed small amounts of very bland food, and God forbid he should get near a trash can with bacon grease. But the illness ran in cycles. For months at a time, Charlie was fine. Then he'd have a flare-up, and Gus would take him over to see Michael. She hid the receipts from James for the veterinary visits because she knew that James would never have condoned spending $500 per winter on a dying dog. But Gus refused to see any other option. That summer, however, Charlie developed a new problem. He drank constantly from the toilet, from Chris's bathwater, from mud puddles. He urinated on rugs and bed quilts, although he'd been house-trained for 6 years. Michael had told Gus that it was probably diabetes. It was not common in Springer Spaniels. It was not fatal. But it was tricky and difficult to control, and every morning she'd have to give him a shot of insulin. Sunday afternoons, Gus took Charlie next door to the Golds and let Michael examine him. Every week they discussed the lack of improvement, the option of putting the dog to sleep. "He's a sick dog," Michael had told her. "I'm not going to think badly of you if you make that decision." The third Saturday in August, Gus walked the path between her house and the Golds, Charlie circling about her heels. Chris was with her, and Emily. They'd been playing over at the Hart house that morning. They tumbled up the side steps in a tornado of paws and feet, the children rushing into the kitchen and Charlie bulleting between Melanie's legs as she held open the door. "Still peeing?" Gus nodded. Charlie, Melanie yelled, get back here. But before the dog could soil a carpet or sprint upstairs, Michael appeared with Charlie heeled at his side. How do you do that? Gus laughed. I can't even get him to sit. Years of practice, Michael answered. You ready? Gus turned to Melanie. Keep an eye on Chris, please. I think M's doing that. What time are we supposed to be at your place tonight? 7, Gus said. We can get the kids to sleep and then act like we don't have any. I think M's doing that. What time are we supposed to be at your place tonight? 7, Gus said. We can get the kids to sleep and then act like we don't have any. Michael patted Gus's stomach. Which should be exceptionally easy for you with your girlish figure. If you weren't my dog's vet, Gus said, I'd sock you for that. They walked off toward the small office Michael had furnished over the garage, laughing and talking, oblivious to the fact that until they were out of sight, Melanie watched them, and the ease that fit over their shoulders like a weathered old flannel blanket. Oh, this is getting sketchy. I'm getting some jealousy vibes. James came up behind Gus in the mirror as she fastened her left earring. How old am I? He asked, skimming his hand over his hair. 32, she said. James' eyes widened. I am not, he insisted. I am 31. Gus smiled. You were born in 1952. Do the math. Oh my God, I thought I was 31. He watched his wife laugh. It's a big deal, he said. You know how sometimes you wake up thinking it's Friday and it's really only Tuesday? Well, I just lost a whole year. Downstairs, the doorbell rang. Daddy, Chris said, bouncing into the bedroom in his Batman pajamas. M's here. Go let her in, Gus said. Tell Melanie we'll be right down. James's eyes met hers in the mirror. Did I tell you how nice you look tonight? He murmured. Gus grinned. That's only because I'm hidden from the waist down in this mirror. Even so, James whispered. Even so, James whispered, and he kissed her neck. And did I tell you, Gus said, that I love all 31 years of you? 32. Oh, Gus frowned. In that case, forget it. She smiled wide and pushed back, standing splendid in a pumpkin silk caftan. You coming? She asked. And when James nodded, she turned off the bedroom light and started down the stairs. In the middle of the dinner party, the dog got sick. They had just finished eating. The men had gone upstairs to tuck Chris and Emily into the king-size bed in the master bedroom. James was coming down the stairs when he heard a cough, followed by an unmistakable hawking sound. He walked down the hallway to find Charlie vomiting the antique Killam carpet, standing in a spreading puddle of his own urine. Gee, damn it, he muttered, hearing the others' footsteps behind him. He grabbed Charlie's collar and yanked him outside. Oh. It's not his fault, Gus said softly. Melanie was already on her hands and knees cleaning up with a dish towel. I know it's not, James tersely responded, but that doesn't make it any easier. He turned to Michael, who was watching from a distance, his hands in his pockets. You can't do anything? No, Michael said, not without putting the dog into insulin shock. Marvelous, James said, scoffing his foot on the carpet. Great. Gus took the dish towel from Melanie, who stood up slowly. Maybe we should go, she said. Michael nodded. And as Gus and James tried to save their antique carpet, the Golds headed upstairs. They found their daughter lost in a sea of sheets with Chris, their hair crisscrossing in the same pillow, streaks of gold and copper. Gently disentangling her, Michael lifted Emily into his arms and carried her downstairs. Gus was waiting by the front door. I'll call you, she said. Do that, Melanie answered, smiling sadly and holding open the door. Michael stayed just a moment longer. He shifted the damp, warm weight of his child in his arms. It may be time, Gus, he said. She shook her head. I'm sorry about this. No, Michael said. I am. This time, the carjacker's face had a canine snout, black receding gums. Get out of the car, he said, and Gus scrambled, deliberately thinking as she threw the keys that this time they had to go faster. She yanked the rear door wide, worked the sadist's latch on the infant seat, grabbed the baby from the car. "Unhook yourself," she shouted to Chris, who was trying, although his little fingers couldn't manage it. "Unhook yourself." She ran to his side of the car. The carjacker slid into the driver's seat, pointing the gun right at her. There was a scratch at Gus's wrist. She looked down in her arms at the baby and realized that all along she'd been holding Charlie. Dream, by the way. That was another dream that Gus had. James got out of bed before the sun rose and pulled on jeans and a t-shirt. Amazing how cool it could be up here before the fog lifted. He ate a bowl of cereal at the kitchen table, deliberately keeping his mind a wide, blank page, then walked down the basement stairs. Charlie, who could always sense him before anyone else could, was leaping around in his wire cage. "Hey, buddy," James said, freeing the latch. "You want to go out? You want to go hunting?" The dog's eyes rolled, his pink tongue lolling in delight. He squatted and peed on the cement floor. James swallowed, then fished his pocket for a key to the gun case. He took out the .22 he was saving for Chris when he got old enough to hunt squirrels and rabbits. With a silicone cloth, James rubbed down the smooth wooden shaft of the bright barrel. He took a pair of bullets and buried them in the pocket of his jeans. The dog sprinted out the front door ahead of James in his element. Charlie sniffed at the ground, pounced on a fat brown toad. He doubled back in circles, tracing his own scent. Dogs are so fucking cute. "This way," James said, whistling, leading the dog deeper into the wooded acreage at the rear of the property. He loaded the bullets into the gun and watched Charlie weaving through the thick underbrush, thinking to flush up a pheasant or partridge, as he'd been bred to. He saw the dog stop, cock his head, look skyward. Tears slowly running down his face, James stepped behind the dog, so quiet and so unfamiliar that Charlie did not even turn around, and lifting the rifle, he shot the dog in the back of the head. "Hi," Gus said, coming into the kitchen. "You're up early." James was washing his hands in the sink. He did not glance up. "Look," he said, "the dog died." Gus paused, halfway across the kitchen. She leaned against the counter, tears immediately in her eyes. "It must have been the insulin," Michael said. "It wasn't," James said, still avoiding her gaze. "I took him out this morning, hunting." If Gus thought it odd that they would have gone hunting months before any major New England wildlife was in season, she did not say so. "Was it a seizure?" she asked, frowning. "It wasn't a seizure. Gus, I did it." She brought her hand up to her throat. "You did what?" she whispered. "I killed him, damn it," James said. "All right, I don't feel good about it. And I wasn't angry because of the rug. I wanted to just help him, to get rid of the pain for him." "So you shot him? What would you have done?" "I would have taken him to Michael," Gus said, her voice hitching. "So he could give Charlie a shot and you could hold him and watch him die?" "This was more humane," James said. "He was my dog. I was the one who had to take care of it." "He was my dog. I was the one who had to take care of it." He crossed the room and looked down at his wife. "What?" he challenged. Gus shook her head. "I don't know you," she said, and she ran out of the house. "What kind of person," Gus asked, her hands shaking on her coffee mug, "shoots his own dog?" Melanie stared across her kitchen table. "It wasn't malicious," she said, but her heart wasn't in it. It was not until a few moments before, when her best friend had run through the side door sobbing, that Melanie realized how much she valued her husband's commitment to heal. "He doesn't kill his parents, does he?" Gus sputtered, as if she had been reading Melanie's mind. "And what am I supposed to say to Chris?" "Tell him that Charlie died and that he feels better now." Gus scrubbed her hands over her face. "I'd be lying," she said. "You'd be making it hurt less," Melanie answered, and without wanting to, both women thought of what James had done and why. Chris was waiting on the porch steps when Gus got home. "Daddy says Charlie's dead," he announced. "I know," Gus said. "I'm sorry." "Are we going to put him in a lifeguard? Are we going to put him in a lifeguard?" "A graveyard?" Gus frowned. What had James done with the dog? I don't think so, honey. Daddy probably buried Charlie somewhere in the woods. Is Charlie an angel now? Gus thought about the Springer, who had always seemed to have wings on his feet. Yeah, I think he is. Chris rubbed his nose. So when will we see him again? Not till we go to heaven, Gus said. Not for a long time. She looked up at Chris, his cheeks silver with tears. Impulsively, she went into the house, Chris trailing her. There, Gus went into the bathroom and packed up her toothbrush and shampoo, her Bic razors, and her apricot perfume. She wrapped these in her cotton nightgown and set them on the bed. She haphazardly pulled clothes from drawers and hangers. How would you like it, she asked Chris, if we lived with him for a while? Next section. Gus and Chris slept in the gold guest bedroom, a narrow space beside the veterinary examination quarters with a double bed, a rickety dresser, and a pervasive odor of alcohol. Aware of how awkward this was, and the imposition, Gus went to bed at 8 o'clock when she settled Christopher in. She lay in the dark beside him, and she tried not to think about James. Michael and Melanie had not said a thing. Not that they could have. Anything mentioned would have come out the wrong way anyways. To his credit, James had phoned 4 times. Twice, he'd walked all the way over, only to hear Gus shouting from a room within the Gold's house that she didn't want to see him. Gus waited until she could no longer hear water running through the pipes upstairs. She counted Chris's even breathing, and then she gently eased herself off the bed. She walked down the hall to the den, where the push buttons of the telephone were glowing in the dark. James answered on the 3rd ring. Hello, he said groggily. It's me. Gus? She could hear him coming awake in starts, sitting up, huddling the phone closer. I wish you'd come home. Where did you bury him? In the woods, back by the stone wall. I'll take you there if you want. I just want to know, Gus said, so I can tell Chris. She had no intention of telling Chris, really. The reason she wanted to know was that she feared, in ways she could barely articulate herself, walking in the woods several years from now after a rainstorm and finding a skeleton. I didn't do this to hurt him. I don't care about the GD carpet. If I could trade that in and get Charlie back healthy, you know I'd do it. But you didn't, she said, did you? She gently set the receiver back in its cradle and pressed her knuckles to her mouth. It was a moment before she realized Michael was standing in front of her. He was wearing sweatpants with a hole in the knee and a faded Tufts t-shirt. I heard noises, he explained. I came down to make sure you were all right. All right, Gus said, the word turning over. She thought of Melanie's precision of words and of what James had said that morning. The dog died. But the dog hadn't really. When you got right down to it, the dog was killed. There was a difference. I'm not all right, she said. I'm not even 50% all right. She felt Michael's hand on her arm. He did what he thought best. He did what he thought was best, Gus. He even took Charlie out hunting beforehand. He knelt down beside Gus. When Charlie died, he was with the person he loved most. I could have given him a shot, but I couldn't have made him as happy before I did it. He stood up, tugged at her hand. Go to sleep, he said, and he led her back to the guest room, his hand riding light and warm on the small of her back. Oh, shit's getting, oh my God. What's about to happen? What is this? What is going on? The next day, Melanie and Gus took the children to the pond. Chris and Emily rushed toward the water while their mothers were still setting up the towels and beach chairs and coolers. Suddenly, a whistle sounded from the lifeguard's deck. A strong, tanned teenager in a red suit jumped into the pond, stroking quickly toward the rock. Melanie and Gus stilled in their beach chairs, paralyzed by the same sudden realization. They could not see their children. Then Emily appeared, led by a woman they did not know. In the murky blue water was a slow-turning oval. Trapped beneath the surface. The lifeguard dove under and re-emerged, swiftly split the water before him and dragged his quarry onto the sand. Chris lay perfectly still, his face white, his chest flat. Gus shoved her way through the crowd, unable to speak, unable to do anything but fall bonelessly to the ground a few feet away from her son. The teenager leaned down, sealed Chris's lips with his own, breathed life. Chris's head turned to the side, and he vomited up water. Gasping, starting to cry, he reached past the lifeguard to the safety of Gus's arms. The teenager stood up. "He should be all right, ma'am," the boy said. "The little girl, his friend? She slipped off the rocks, and he jumped in to get her. Problem was, she landed in a spot where she could stand. Your son didn't." "Mom," Chris said. Gus turned to the lifeguard, shaking. "I'm sorry, thank you." "No problem," the boy said, and walked back into the whitewash stand. "Mom," Chris said, and then more insistently, "Mom!" He framed his hands, fish cold and trembling on both sides of her face. "What?" Gus said, her heart so full it was heavy on the baby inside. "What is it?" "I saw him," Chris said, his eyes shining. "I saw Charlie again." That afternoon, Gus and Chris moved back to the Hart household. They carried their toiletries and clothes up the stairs. With some careful unpacking and casual rearranging, by nightfall, when James came home from the hospital and checked on his sleeping son and saw his wife waiting in bed, it seemed as though they had never left. This time, during the nightmare, Gus managed to hurl the keys farther than she had ever before, under another vehicle that was parked all the way across the street. She unstrapped her seatbelt and got to the baby's door, managed to unlatch her and drag her free as she heard the footsteps behind her again. "You bastard!" Gus yelled, for the first time fighting back in this nightmare. She kicked the tire. She looked into the back seat, expecting to see Chris's face as they squealed away. But instead, she saw her husband reach into the rear of the car to set him free. And she wondered why it had taken so long to notice that all this time, James had been sitting in the passenger seat. Oh my gosh, this is so metaphorical. Okay, now we're back to now. So, now of November 1997. "I'm hiring a lawyer for Chris," James announced Saturday over dinner. The words erupted from him like a belch, and he belatedly covered his mouth with his napkin, as if he could take them back and declare them more politely. A lawyer. The serving platter dropped the last few inches from Gus's fingers, clattering on the table. "You what?" "I spoke confidentially to Gary Morehouse about this. Remember him from the Groton reunion? It was his suggestion." "But Chris didn't commit a crime. Being depressed is not a crime." Kate turned to her father, incredulous. "You mean they think Chris killed Emily?" "Absolutely not," Gus said, crossing her arms, suddenly shivering. "Chris doesn't need a lawyer. A psychiatrist, yes, but a lawyer?" James nodded. "Gary said that when Chris told Detective Marone it was a double suicide, he implicated himself. Just by saying there wasn't a third person, that it was just Em and him, turned the suspicion onto him." "That's crazy," Gus said. "Gus, I'm not saying Chris did what they think," James said softly, "but I think we ought to be prepared." "You will not," Gus said, her voice shaking, "hire a defense lawyer for a crime that never happened." "Gus." "You will not, James. I won't let you." Her arms went tighter around herself, also meeting at the middle of her back. "If they find out we've gotten a lawyer, they'll think Chris has something to hide." "They already think that. They're doing an autopsy on Emily and sending the gun in for tests. Look, you and I know what really happened. Chris knows what really happened. Shouldn't we get someone trained to let the police know what really happened?" "Nothing happened," Gus yelled. She spun around, facing the kitchen. "Nothing happened," she repeated. "Tell that," her conscience murmured, to Melanie. She suddenly remembered the day Chris woke up and wound his arms around her neck, and she realized that he no longer had the breath of a baby. It was stale and ordinary, not sweet and milky. And she had instinctively reared back from him, as if this had nothing to do with the transition to solid food, but instead with the fact that this small, toddling body was now capable of holding in its sins. Gus took several deep breaths, then turned back toward the dining room table. Kate was bent like a willow stem over her plate, her tears collecting in its pale reflection. The serving platter remained untouched, and James's chair was empty. Next section. Kate stood uneasily at the doorway of her brother's hospital room, one hand resting on the knob in case he totally tripped out and became some kind of head case, like that kind with the greasy blonde hair who'd been skulking behind a gurney when she came down the hall with her mom. Actually, she hadn't even wanted to come visit. Chris would be home on Tuesday. Plus, the doctors had said something about surrounding him with people who cared about him, but Kate didn't think that included herself. Most of her interactions with her older brother in the past year had been hostile, fighting over time in the bathroom, over entering a room without knocking first, over catching him with his hands under Emily's sweater. It freaked her out to think about Chris in a rubber room. Well, not rubber exactly, but still. He looked different, with dark circles under his eyes and this hunted look, like everyone was out to get him. Certainly not like the swimming star who'd swum a 2-minute butterfly last year. Kate felt a pang in her chest and silently swore to let Chris have the bathroom first every morning. All those times she'd screamed at him, drop dead, and look at how close he has come. And look at how close he has come. Hey, Kate said, and she was embarrassed to see that her voice trembled. She glanced over her shoulder, but to her surprise, her mother had disappeared. How are you feeling? Chris shrugged. Like shit, he said. Kate bit her lip, trying to remember what her mother had said. Cheer him up. Don't discuss Emily. Make small talk. We won our soccer game. Chris lifted flat, dull eyes to her. He did not say a word, but he did not have to. Emily's dead, Kate, he was sneering. Chris lifted flat, dull eyes to her. He did not say a word, but he did not have to. Emily's dead, Kate, he was sneering. You think I care about your stupid game? I scored 3 goals, Kate stammered. Maybe if she didn't... I scored 3 goals, Kate stammered. Maybe if she didn't face him... ... She turned toward the window, which overlooked the incinerator, spitting out the thick black smoke. God, she breathed. I wouldn't give this view to someone who's... God, she breathed. I wouldn't give this view to someone who's... Chris made a sound. Kate whirled around and clapped her hand to her mouth. Oh, I wasn't supposed to say that, she muttered, and then she realized Chris was smiling. She had made him smile. What did they tell you to talk to me about? Chris asked. Kate sat down on the edge of the bed. Anything to make you happy, she admitted. What would make me happy, he said, is knowing when the funeral's going to be. Monday, Kate said, leaning back on her elbows, relaxing in this new tentative trust. But I'm absolutely, positively not supposed to tell you that. Chris let a slow smile painfully stretch his face. Don't worry, he said. I won't hold it against you. And I'm going to take a break. Break time. Go get snacks. Go get some hot tea. Alrighty, we are back from break and we are picking up on page 48. No, 49. Just kidding. When Gus and James entered Chris's room on Monday morning, he was sitting on the edge of the bed, dressed in an ill-fitting pair of blue chinos and the shirt he'd been wearing on Friday night. The blood stains had been rinsed out, but lingered in the fabric like ghosts, shifting pink beneath the fluorescent lights. The gauze wrapping his head had been, the gauze wrapping his head had been traded for a small butterfly bandage at his brow. His hair was damp, neatly combed. Good, he said, coming to his feet. Let's go. Gus stopped. Go where? To the funeral, Chris said. You didn't plan to leave me here. Gus and James exchanged a look. That was exactly what they had been planning, at the recommendation of the adolescent psychiatric ward doctors, who had debated the pro of letting Chris grieve versus the con of touching a very raw nerve and reminding him that with Emily gone, he didn't want to be alive. Gus cleared her throat. Em's funeral isn't today. Chris looked at her dark dress, at his father's civilian clothes. I suppose you're going out dancing, he said. He came toward them with jerky, uncoordinated movements. Kate told me, he explained, and I'm going. I can't believe they wouldn't want him to go to the funeral. Like, you're basically telling him not to grieve, which is a horrible, horrible thing to do because you're telling him not to feel his feelings, which causes all kinds of issues. And I'm just like, I can't believe that they're doing this right now. Honey, Gus said, reaching for his arm, the doctors don't think this is a very good idea. Fuck the doctors, Mom, he said, his voice cracking. He threw off her touch. I want to see her before I can't ever see her again. Chris, James said, Emily's gone. Best put it behind you and get yourself healed. Just like that, Chris said, his words spinning higher, like threads of glass. So if Mom died and you were stuck in the hospital the day of her funeral and the doctors told you that you were too sick to leave, you'd just roll over and go back to sleep. It's not the same, James said. It's not like you have a broken leg. Chris rounded on them. Why don't you just say it, he yelled. You think I'm going to watch Em get buried and throw myself off the nearest cliff. The day you're released, we can go to the cemetery, Gus promised. Gus promised. You can't keep me here, Chris said, stalking the door. James jumped up and grabbed his shoulders. He swatted his father away. Let go, he panted. Chris, James said strongly, don't. I can sign myself out. They won't let you, Gus said. They know today's the funeral. You can't do this. You can't do this, Chris shouted, jerking away from James and cuffing him on the jaw with his arm. Jerking away from James and cuffing him on the jaw with his arm. James staggered back, holding his hand to his mouth, and Chris ran out of the room. Gus tore after him. Stop him, she yelled to the nurses at the main desk. She heard a flurry of activity behind her, but she let the boy go to the funeral. Oh my God, this is tearing me up right now. Ugh. Gus tore after him. Stop him, she yelled to the nurses at the main desk. She heard a flurry of activity behind her, but she could not take her eyes off Chris. Not when the locked doors did not give way to his tightened pulls. Not when the orderlies twisted his arms behind his back and plunged a needle into his biceps. Not when he slumped to the floor with the glitter of accusations in his eyes and the taste of Emily's name on his lips. It had been Michael's plan to sit Shiva following the burial service. Because Melanie had refused to have anything to do with preparations, it had fallen to Michael to order bagels and lox, salads, coffee, and cookies. Some neighbor, not Gus, had arranged the food on the dining table by the time they returned from the cemetery. Melanie went straight upstairs with her bottle of Valium. Michael sat on the living room couch, accepting the condolences of his dentist, a veterinary colleague, some clients, Emily's friends. They approached in a pack, a swelling amorphous mass that looked as if it might part at any minute to reveal his daughter in its center. "Mr. Gold," one girl said. Heather or Heidi, Michael thought, her sad eyes a faded Liberty blue. "We don't know how this could have happened." She touched his hand, her own palm milk soft. Her hand was the same size as Emily's. "I didn't see it either," Michael replied, realizing for the first time how true that was. On the surface, Em had been busy and bright, a beautiful tempest of a teenager. He'd liked what he'd seen, so he never thought to dig deeper. Too frightening to unearth the specters of drugs, of sex, of adult choices that he didn't yet want her to be making. He was still holding Heather's hand. Her fingernails were small ovals, pale seashells you might stash in a pocket. Michael raised the girl's hand to his face and cradled it against his cheek. The girl leaped backward, snatching away her hand, her fingers recoiling, her cheeks flushed. She turned away, swallowed immediately by a fold in the group of her friends. Michael cleared his throat, wanting to say something, but what? "You reminded me of her? I was wishing you were my daughter?" Nothing seemed right. He stood and made his way past well-wishers and teary relatives to the foyer. "Excuse me," he said in a commanding voice. He waited until every eye was turned toward him. "On behalf of Melanie and myself, I'd like to thank you for coming today. We appreciate your kind words and your support. Please stay as long as you like." And then, to the incredulous stares of 50 people who knew him well, Michael Gold left his own home. One more section, and then we are going to call it a day today. There were 2 visiting sessions in the locked psychiatric ward, one at 9:30 in the morning and one at 3. Chris's mother not only managed to be there for both of them, but also sweet-talked the nurses into letting her stay past the allotted time for the visit, so that when he came back from speaking with a psychiatrist or taking a shower in the communal bathroom, he'd often find her still there waiting. But when Chris woke up from his medically induced stupor on the day of Emily's funeral, his mother was not there. He didn't know if this was because it was not yet 3, if the doctors had prohibited her visit in light of the morning drama, or if she was just plain scared to show up after screwing him over like that. He inched up in bed and scrubbed his hand over his face. The inside of his mouth felt like sandpaper, and his mind was wheeling, as if a fly were spirographing around inside his head. A nurse carefully pushed open the door. "Oh, good," she said. "You're up. You have a visitor." If his mother was here to tell him about the funeral, he didn't want to see her. He wanted to know everything: the design of the bevel on the coffin, the lyrics of the prayers they had said for Em, the texture of the earth where she was buried. His mother could not possibly have remembered these details, and having to fill in the holes in her story would be worse than never hearing it at all. But as the nurse stepped out of the way, Emily's father came into the room. "Chris," he said, stopping awkwardly a foot away from the bed. Chris felt his stomach muscles jerk. "I probably shouldn't be here," Michael said. He shrugged out of his coat and began to wring it in his hands. "In fact, I know I shouldn't be here." He laid the coat on the edge of the chair and stuffed his hands into his trouser pockets. "You know, Em was buried today." "I heard that," Chris said. He was pleased at how steady he sounded. "I wanted to come." Michael nodded. "She would have liked that." "They wouldn't let me," Chris said, and his voice cracked. He tried to duck his head so that Michael wouldn't see the tears, instinctively assuming that Em's father, like his own, would see them as a weakness. "I'm not sure it was so important to be there today," Michael said slowly. "I think you were with Em when it mattered most." He looked at Chris until the boy glanced up. "Tell me," Michael whispered. "Tell me what happened Friday night." Chris stared at Michael, caught not by the power of his question, but by the way Emily played over her father's face. But by the way Emily played over her father's face. Her eyes the same marble blue, her chin as determined, her smile hiding just behind the lines of strain at his mouth. It was easy for him to picture Emily asking, not Michael. "Tell me," she begged, her mouth still wet from his own, blood running down her temple. "Tell me what happened." His gaze slid away. "I don't know." His gaze slid away. I don't know. You must know, Michael said. He grasped Chris's chin and the remarkable radiant heat of adolescence burning his fingertips so quickly he let go almost immediately. He spent 5 minutes trying to get Chris to speak to him again, to spit out a detail or a piece of information that he could carry with him in his breast pocket the way one might tuck the note of a lover or a lucky charm. But when Michael left the room, the only thing he knew for certain was that Chris had not been able to look him in the eye. Oh my God, I can't even deal. Okay, we're going to end it there because that's a good cliffhanger. He spent 5 minutes trying to get Chris to speak to him again, to spit out a detail or a piece of information that he could carry with him in his breast pocket, the way one might tuck the note of a lover or a lucky charm. But when Michael left the room, the only thing he knew for certain was that Chris had not been able to look him in the eye. And that is on page 53. We are ending today, so we went from 37 to 53 today. And our next discussion will be tomorrow, probably. Or today, maybe. I don't know, depending on when I put this video. But thank you so much for joining me. I hope that you're enjoying this book as much as I am. Like, I'm so into it, and I feel like it's really just now picking up and just now getting good. So I'm super excited. It's definitely an intense book, but at the same time, like, I think it's good to feel these things, like, from an outside perspective sometimes, because a lot of times we don't want to feel them in our own life. So sometimes it helps to, like, read something like this where it's like disconnected. But
how y'all feel out there?
I'm light years, call me eons. When the snare kick in, the beat is neon. Lights, yeah, I'm feeling magnificent. Care less what I'm up against.